We seem to have Katie twice. And now we have Jonathan Keller, who's not even supposed to be on this call.
Jonathan is joining. I think he used my link.
Oh, he is joining us.
Sounds like he changed his name.
Yes, I did. It's pandemonium over here.
We like it that way. Well, we're not starting until Ariel and Rick get on, or at least Ariel gets on. Alec, again, did you read about somebody needing to eventually screen share? Did you see that from Jessica?
I am aware that we may have some presentations, and I believe I can make people co-hosts for that purpose, so that they will be able to trigger the screen share function.
Okay. Because you do know I'm an idiot, so.
Well, I'm not too far ahead of you, Mark, but I have the power of the pen, or whatever you want to call this power.
You may not be too far ahead of me, but you are permanently ahead of me.
And I have that power, which is to mute folks. So.
Uh-oh.
And if Jessica, if you will be giving our first presentation, maybe I'll just make you a co-host now.
Sure. If you trust me that far. You never know.
If we didn't trust you, you wouldn't be invited. So Alec, you can see everybody who's on. Would you like to shout out to everybody who's on so we know who's here?
That is the panelists as well as the attendees. I can. So, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. But it looks like we have, well, Mark Shames, who is the
Hi, everyone.
Yes, from Community Board 6, and Sheena Kang from CHPC, as well as Jessica Katz. We have Natasha Amott. Is that how you say your last name, Natasha?
Yeah, did you say Amott, long A?
I did.
Well, awesome. Nobody usually gets it right. You
Okay. From Community Board 6, and Katie Ferrara Ianitu, and Jonathan Keller from DCP, Jonah Rogoff,
close.
Sorry about that. Vilma Jeremiah. How do you say your last name, Vilma? I should know this.
Jeremiah.
So this is just a pronunciation game for me now.
Yeah.
Rebecca Cobert. Rick Lufglass from CV6.
Yes, hello.
Did I miss anyone? Joanne? I missed you, Joe. But I believe that's yes. So we are waiting for Ariel, but
she was having trouble getting on, but she was just on email. She's about to sign in.
Great.
And for those who
And
don't
then
know,
everyone knows that Wednesday is the general board meeting, right?
yes, indeed, Rick.
And that one you should have gotten invites for.
And everybody should know that Rick is the chair of the economic development portion of our committee. Ariel is the chair of the housing portion of our committee. And I am by default the chair of the waterfront portion of the committee.
And we've got a good 32 participants here. So as soon as we start, and we have both committee members who are listed as panelists and have video and audio access. And then, and obviously the presenters, and then everyone else is very much welcome to add into the chat, and I'll be monitoring questions as we when we have the opportunity to ask questions. So people will have an opportunity for input and queries.
Ariel says she doesn't have access as
Okay.
Well, I don't have the power to fix that, I don't think, but Mike has been alerted. So hopefully that will be remedied fast.
Yes.
I hope so.
Ariel,
Meanwhile, how is everybody?
Rick, if you're texting with Ariel, I did send her the panelist link because she's having trouble getting in.
Yeah, I did that as well.
Oh, okay.
So, Kiamisha Small, same thing. This is
I think we'll all figure out the Zoom community board meeting just about the time we're all vaccinated. So
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm gonna get vaccinated long before the rest of you do, so. I'm old with many comorbidities. Lucky
well,
me.
get in line, Mark. It's gonna be a a hot ticket.
I know. I'm expecting to get it before you, but after every Republican in New York State.
I'm not so sure you should all be confident that we're not going to still do these over Zoom after all this is over, by the way.
No, but I think that hopefully we'll get to a point of hybrids where some people will be able to be in person, socially distanced, and others will have access by Zoom. I think that's something to strive for. When that happens, I don't know. It'll take being in a space that has sufficient social distancing ability.
Yeah, it'd be
So we
nice
will
to have
see.
some blended meetings. I'll make sure to stay on Zoom.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I missed being in a crowded room till late at night with you all, but I did attend several meetings recently where I was like cooking dinner and doing an art project with my kid and then being able to half listen. And there was a lot of opportunity to be involved in things I could never have done before.
Understood. I shaved and showered today.
Mazel tov.
And I know I didn't really have to, so, but I did anyway, because I respect you all.
So I saw Ariel she's on, I think.
Good.
I don't see her, but she said she was on. I don't see her.
I see Guy. There's Ariel,
Yay.
but she's got something off.
All right.
All right. 10th try is a charm. Oh my God. Hi.
Hi, Ariel. We've been waiting for you.
You know what I think screwed me up? I was on a Zoom call that I dropped out of, and I have a feeling like that. I don't know. Zoom's wonky that way. So I don't know. Sorry about that. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I apologize for that glitch, but I think, and I think there are still apparently a lot of economic, waterfront, community development, and housing members who have been emailing around and trying to get in, but it looks like most of us are on here now. Keep trying to get on.
Alec, I think if you go to participants, you can write allowed to talk to whoever you want, and that brings them into the main room. I'm pretty sure that's what I did that got Ariel here. I'm not totally sure about that though.
Thank you.
Great. That's really useful to know. I wish I'd known that 10 minutes ago, and I'm sorry.
I don't know if there's anyone else that you want to let in, but if you just look at the
Well,
list.
I know like Vilma Hermia is on, she is not in, and she's on the participant list. Oh, there she is. Vilma, you're there too. Okay, great. All right, I know you had
Somebody
trouble.
asked if EPA was going to be here, and I believe the answer is no.
Okay, all right, so so should we get started?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's this meeting started out as being, we were initially, before we had such a wonderful roster of presenters, we were this committee has been looking over the last couple of months at the impact of COVID on businesses in the district, and also we had a presenter in our October meeting from Community Board 6 in Manhattan, discussing affordable housing in comparatively across the city. And then right at that point, we got the news that we were about to launch back into our the Gowanus proposed rezoning was going to be coming back to us again, and that we would be going to Europe early next year. So that created an awful lot of questions, and I know we have a great group of people on the committee that were asking some very critical questions about where the community board stood on a lot of questions. And since we cover, while we don't have a necessarily our committee tends to be more informational, we have been looking very closely at issues related to each of the labels in our in our acronym. So this meeting was going to be about housing, and when DCP came back to the land use committee last month, there was a tremendous amount of input, really interesting commentary going on on the chat line. And one of the things I just realized, having been on, we've all been in various modes of Zoom, and I wasn't quite sure what format we were using, but I realized, because I was on the outside of this, my first 6 tries getting in tonight, that on the outside of this, you don't see the list of participants. We have 34 participants, and I don't know what happens when people outside of the panelists check it right in there, but I know that we can see that. So I want to encourage people to write into the chat. I am still going through the 68 pages of chat from the DCP presentation, and we are some of the initiative for tonight was around looking at Gowanus, stepping a little bit outside of Gowanus to look at it as our rezoning fits into the greater condition and situation of housing citywide. And for that reason, we went to the Citizens Housing Planning Council, CHPC, who has been, they've been around, I think, about 80 years, since 1937, is that right? And so we thought about ways in which we could further this conversation about how the Gowanus rezoning fit across the city. So that is why we have Jessica Katz, who's the executive director, here tonight, and Sheena Kang, who is a policy analyst. And they're going to do a presentation for us to kick us off. I think we'll do a couple of immediate questions right afterwards. And then we have DCP is also here to talk about their ongoing plans for coastal resiliency. And so that's also broader than just the Gowanus rezoning. But we'll regroup after both presentations, and then we can take questions from within the committee and any questions that come in on the chat line. And as I said, if you're out there and you're not seeing the participants, we have a total of 34 people here, and we will be looking at your questions. So please do write into the chat line. With that, I'll hand it over to Jessica Katz, Executive Director of CHBC.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Let me just share my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. So thanks again to Ariel and everyone on this committee of Board 6 for having me. Citizens Housing and Planning Council, as Ariel said, we were founded in 1937. We're kind of part of this storied fabric of civic organizations formed in the 1930s here in New York City. And our mission is to do advocacy and education around the most pressing housing and planning needs of New York City's neighborhoods. Our board is very large. We have 90 board members that kind of span the housing and planning field. So we have a lot of architects and land use attorneys. We have financiers and developers and planners from all parts of the sector kind of coming together to lend their expertise. And we do research and education on a variety of the most pressing topics. And this year, there are a lot of pressing topics in housing and affordable housing. So we're happy to be here today to provide some of the citywide context to help you guys as you work through this discussion around the Gowanus rezoning. So I'll start with talking about some of our other adjacent projects that may be relevant to some of the discussions that you're having. The first is a project that we call Public Housing Revolution. It's taking the example of the council housing in the UK. There was in London in 1980, there were about 3 times as many public housing units as there are here, and they were in much, much worse condition. So in the UK, they've had more than a generation to work through some of these issues around the best way to what they call regenerate public housing. And they've come up with some really interesting ideas, some of which are some of the same types of tools that we have, working with a private developer to do some infill on a site, doing some redevelopment projects and kind of bringing in a public-private partnership. But as they did that, they also elevated the voice of the residents of public housing in such a way that they really were driving the train in terms of what the redevelopment project would look like and who the development partners were. So even to the point where public housing residents it would be like if here, instead of NYCHA doing an RFP, selecting a developer and then going to the residents and saying on this unveiling of saying, this is who we picked, it would be the converse. The tenants would look at a list of developers, they would interview them, pick who they like the best, and then the tenants and the developer would go together back to NYCHA to say, this is our plan of what we want to do with our development. So we did a trip to London last year with a couple of council members, a couple of NYCHA residents, some of the RAD developers who are on our board, and really just went there to really learn as a group together about how this really worked on the ground in the UK. And it was just such a mind-blowing trip. And I really hope that this is all over soon so we can continue doing some of those study trips to learn together from other places, the kind of work you can do to really see real resident decision-making in public housing and how that can be a real benefit for everyone. So that's one project we've been working on, lots of resources and reports about that process on our website. I also wanted to thank and praise you guys for doing this resolution earlier in the year around basement apartment conversions. This is something that CHBC has been researching for a very, very long time. We really think that this is the unsung hero of affordable housing solutions that's like literally right beneath our feet, that we need to create some regulatory reforms that are going to make basements safer and more habitable. people are living in basement apartments, whether we like it or not. So we can kind of cover our eyes and pretend like it's not happening, or we can work towards making it better for both the tenant and typically low-income homeowners to create some, naturally occurring affordable housing, as it's sometimes known, in places all across the city where typically HPD programs can't touch. So for example, Community Board 6, many of you probably don't know me, despite that I was at HPD working on all the new construction, all the supportive housing, and all the preservation deals, because there's been relatively little HPD activity in Community Board 6. So I never had a reason to come before you to pitch one of our projects, because there were just very few and far between. Whereas there's other community boards that, have seen my face all too often. So basement apartments is one of the tools that we may have to create something like affordable housing in neighborhoods where HPD really doesn't have a lot of tools, and the neighborhood isn't well suited to the kind of scale until we get to this point with the Gowanus rezoning. So that's another, we were thrilled to see that resolution. We took a look at the presentation that John Sanchez from CB6 in the Bronx did, and we've been working with him on advocating for the rezoning in Soho. And so we've been, the convention of comparing Community Board 6s or Community Board 2s across the city, I think is a really smart one. So as you see, we stole that convention here a bit, and I've been grateful to work with him on some Soho stuff. So what's next? So this is a image from a report by the Citizens Budget Commission. The top line is the growth in employment in New York City since 1980. And the bottom line is the growth in the housing stock since 1980. So the employment has grown by more than 35% since 1980, but the housing stock has only grown by 19%. And then that spread has only gotten worse in the last 10 years. As you can see, those two lines start to really diverge since 2010, where the employment in New York City has gone up by 22% and the housing stock has only gone up by 4%. So at CHPC, we're unabashedly housing supply advocates. And this is why. We have a hugely growing economy, and people talk about quote unquote overdevelopment in New York City, but that's not borne out in the numbers of how the housing stock has gone over the past decade and over the past generation. And then if you compare New York City to other cities across the country, the picture gets even more bleak. So the only cities in the past 10 years who have created less housing per capita are Detroit, Baltimore, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, and Chicago. So those are the 5 cities that are come the closest to who created even less housing than New York City did. Obviously, those are cities that have not seen the same kind of economic growth that we have here. They don't have nearly the same kind of rent burdens and pressures, and they're still grappling with substantial vacancies, substantial housing quality issues, and are not looking at the same kind of housing market pressures as we see here. And yet we're in the ballpark as those other cities in terms of how much housing we've created. So again, this myth of the overdevelopment of New York City just is not borne out by the data. And again, this is Citizens Budget Commission. So then if you look at some of the cities that we think of as having a high quality of life, being kind of a booming city with a progressive outlook, the Seattles, your Austins, your Denvers, those places are building 4 and 5 times as much housing per capita as we have. And then as we all hear, I don't spend a lot of time in those places, but you see how they've built housing in much more to keep pace with the kind of exuberance and excitement of people moving to their city. And they're going to do a much, much better job at keeping that quality of life, even while they see an explosion of jobs and population. So with that nationwide context and citywide context, we wanted to compare not Community Board 6s across, but kind of put the Gowanus rezoning in the context of some of the other rezonings that we've seen so far under this administration. So in terms of population density, Gowanus is, a third of where Jerome Avenue is, a third of where Inwood is, less density in terms of population than East Harlem, and around the same as East New York, which was the first rezoning under Mayor de Blasio. It also is a substantial, you guys are a substantial job center. So the number of jobs per square mile in Brooklyn CB6 is very, very high, much higher than some of the other rezonings that we've seen, and even with Inwood. So there's a lot of jobs being created here and not very much new housing available. This is the scary one. So a doctor, a public health expert, and a housing policy expert will all tell you that in some great and some very scary ways, your zip code is really your destiny in this city and in this country so far. That extends literally to life expectancy. So the life expectancy of your average CB6 resident is 5 years longer than if you're growing up in Far Rockaway, Queens. It's 3 years longer than if you're growing up in CB4 and around Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. It's 2 years longer than if you're living in East New York. So your zip code is your destiny while you're alive, and you literally are cutting your life short based on what your opportunities are and what your access to amenities are in these various neighborhoods. And Gowanus is by far at the top of the list. It's a very high opportunity neighborhood, and you guys are literally living longer because of it. Access to transit, obviously, in this neighborhood is in CB6 is very, very high compared to some of the other neighborhoods in general. So I want to talk a little bit about New York City's Where We Live initiative. So the Obama administration reimagined, kind of redefined the Fair Housing Act and decided that, I mean, this had always been true, but they decided to finally make good on the spirit of the Fair Housing Act, which is that it's not enough to just say we don't discriminate. So putting a sign up to say Black people can't rent an apartment here and making sure, taking down that sign is not good enough. You can't just fail to discriminate or prosecute someone if you're discriminating. You actually have to affirmatively further fair housing. So it was a realization that for decades, we had public policies that were enforcing segregation and creating segregation, and that a colorblind policy that was just sat back and waited for someone to be discriminated against and then kind of meted out consequences if that were the case is not enough to undo some of the impacts of these public housing policies. So that's known as the AFFH rule, or affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now that rule was promptly rescinded by the Trump administration, but the city of New York decided to continue to pursue the process under AFFH, which is to do a research and a report about what the jurisdiction was prepared to go through in order to affirmatively further fair housing. So it was really remarkable, actually, the process and the analysis that the city went through. I think really, I find very little to kind of congratulate this administration on, to be frank with you. But I think the Where We Live process has been really remarkable in its reach and its ability to really confront some really difficult, challenging conversations. And for the city of New York, it's very rare. You know, we tend to think of ourselves as this liberal bastion where segregation no longer exists and where discrimination no longer exists. And we all want to live here because it's such a diverse city. So it's a real about face, particularly for city government itself, to really do some soul searching and say, maybe that's not true. Maybe let's take a look at the ways in which that's not true and take a look at what it would take to undo and dismantle some of the systems that we've put in place that maybe felt colorblind at the time, or maybe did have racial animus at their core at the time. But at this point, we're just living with them. It's like the air we breathe. And it's really going to take some affirmative steps to undo those things. So one of those things, I mean, confronting segregation, I don't want to underscore the fact that for a government agency to use the term segregation is quite remarkable. I mean, the most administrations kind of for reasonable reasons go to great lengths to deny the fact that segregation exists under their watch. And here we have the city saying, yep, we're segregated. And this is the difficult steps that we need to take to undo that process. So the Where We Live report the final report was issued about a month ago. It's fairly recent, although it's been about a year in public comment that was delayed, obviously, by COVID. But that final report is out now. And we expect that one of the first few executive orders that the Biden administration takes is to reinstate the FFH rule and make this not just kind of a nice process that the city went through of soul searching, but actually a matter of regulation and law. So one of the goals in the Cities Where We Live report has to do with equitable growth and equitable development, and making sure that all New Yorkers benefit equally from the benefits of development, and that we're not burdening any one particular neighborhood unduly at the same time. And access to opportunity, developing housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. These are all goals of the Where We Live report and the Where We Live process that, again, right now is just something that the city did voluntarily, but that we're fairly likely that under a Biden administration will kind of be reinstated as a legal requirement. So one of the goals and the strategies is to facilitate equitable housing development in New York City and the region. Talks about increasing housing opportunities for low-income New Yorkers, especially in amenity-rich neighborhoods. And then they literally name in the action items to advance proposals for neighborhood rezonings in Gowanus and Soho NoHo, to expand the housing stock, add new affordable housing, increase neighborhood diversity, and other neighborhood planning objectives. So the Gowanus rezoning, you know, it can be, it should be, it must be about equity. So here's some of the ways that from CHPC's citywide vantage point, we think those kind of equity goals could be accomplished here. And there's 4 areas. I think school desegregation is a really important one, and District 15 obviously has been at the vanguard of focusing on school desegregation and really naming that and tackling the difficult challenge of doing that. The fair housing principles we talked about a bit. And then 2 more specific ones to CB6 and the Gowanus area specifically. One is around justice for NYCHA that I know is actively part of the negotiations that folks are having around the Gowanus rezoning, and then environmental justice around resiliency and the Gowanus Canal cleanup as well. So to me, there could be a way for a rezoning to meet these 4 goals. And I think you guys are having all the right conversations around pushing for these values as part of the rezoning, as outcomes of the rezoning. So we just wanted to kind of name them and lay them out in the citywide context in comparison to some of the other rezonings that have gone forward. So with that, I will take any questions that you may have. I see one question in the chat about some homes are in the flood zones around basements. So yes, in all of our mapping on our website, we exclude the floodplain from our basement apartments initiative.
Another question in here was around the vacancies due to the presumed exodus of a lot of people because of COVID. And this was an ongoing conversation during DCP's presentation about acclimating to a post-COVID, potentially different world of possibly doing other kinds of housing, either related to people that have left residential housing or converting office space, et cetera. So just wondering if that's something that I feel most started that question.
Sure. So, you know, the jury's still out about the extent to which COVID will or has caused an exodus. I think when we were the epicenter of the epicenter back in the spring, there was, you know, no better than a rumor or an assumption that somehow our urban population density was somehow a driver for COVID. And so if you move to the suburbs, or if you move to Charlotte, or if you move to Ann Arbor, that somehow you'd be protected. That's not true. If you ever want a presentation about population density and COVID, we have done a lot of research on that as well. Population density is not related to COVID. It never has been, not even when we were the epicenter. Even when we were at our height, the suburbs had higher COVID rates per capita than New York City. Rural areas in the US had higher COVID rates than New York City, even back in April. And within the 5 boroughs, population density and COVID rates seem to be almost opposite of each other. So like there was places in Staten Island that are mostly single family homes that had terrible COVID rates. Elmhurst and Corona that were the epicenter is relatively low density. And then there was higher density places that saw very little COVID at all. So while at the time there was this rumor of like, that must be a New York City problem. So maybe if you leave, we'll do better. You know, now COVID is exploding all around the country. So it's not at all clear. I mean, I'm very grateful that I stayed and never entertained leaving, but certainly now I think folks who left are maybe reconsidering their options. So I think the jury's out on whether there's been a COVID flight or not. But certainly COVID has affected our economy in a pretty serious way. So we think that there will be a softening at the very, very high end of the market. So the $30,000 a month apartment is now going to be a $20,000 a month apartment, but that's not the same thing as creating enough housing supply for everybody who needs it. That pressure still exists. Those two lines of jobs and housing, like they didn't collapse in on each other. There's not that many people moved to Charlotte in the last 6 months that would resolve that problem. But certainly if you're looking to buy a $20 million penthouse, you might be able to scoop that up for 15 million. That we probably know, but the rest I think we're still looking at data for, and it doesn't look to be as serious as we once feared.
Okay, this is a question from Paul through Natasha, which is in any of those other rezonings. I know that you're the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. However, there were manufacturing districts, particularly I know along in East New York. Do you and because affordable housing next to good jobs is important, and that's one of the big driving issues in Gowanus. Was that studied, do you know, in terms of the relationship between what happened in the manufacturing districts and any of those other zonings? Not sure if that came up in your research.
Jerome Avenue also has some manufacturing as well. I think in those other cases, I would venture to say that they didn't have the same kind of manufacturing activity that you all have, and that the rezoning doesn't have, in those cases, I don't think the rezoning had this explicit goal of supporting and continuing a manufacturing use. It was almost the reverse. It was like, this manufacturing is not coming back, so let's figure out something else to do with this land. With certainly a few exceptions, but I think Gowanus is unique in that sense, with the obviously exception of Soho, which actually is entirely zone manufacturing right now, funny as it seems, since it's entirely pretty much residential and retail. Neither residential nor retail are currently legal in Soho.
Are there any other questions on the committee? Anybody can just raise their hand. I think it can all be unmuted.
Well,
if you have questions.
Yeah, hi, this is Neil. I just had a quick question. In terms of the AFFH and then the We Are Live New York, hopefully I didn't get that right. Hopefully I got that right. But was there any final resolution from that initiative, or is it still continuing? And when the AFFH is reinstated, hopefully they're going to go full steam ahead.
So I think the city's plan is to go full steam ahead anyway. So that final report was issued about a month ago. I don't know, Sheena, if you want to try to find that link and throw it in the chat for people. So yeah, that report is final. It went public, I think literally about a month ago. It was definitely this fall. And they're planning on going full speed ahead. And I think the criticisms of an early draft were basically that they did this very smart outreach and public engagement process and a very smart and very soul-searching analysis process. And then the next steps were kind of like non-existent. So there was a lot of criticism of the city that they were readily able to lay out the problems, but then when it came to the solutions, everyone got kind of like mealy-mouthed and let's do a task force on this, and nobody could quite put their finger on what actual tasks you could do to further fair housing. And the final draft really really responded to that criticism in quite a direct fashion. So you can take a look, and that at what their recommendations ended up being. How the Where We Live report plays into a reinstated AFFH. We don't know if they'll just undo the Trump executive order and then we'll just take that literal report and just send it to the Biden administration, or whether there'll be some changes to it. But I think they are planning on going full speed ahead on Where We Live, regardless of what happens with AFFH.
Jessica, can I ask, do you have a view on how the community preference policy interacts with the sort of fair housing aspect of the Gowanus rezoning plan? It seems to me like a community preference might work in some different kinds of places that would be rezoned, but in a community board that is already predominantly white, it might undermine some of the fair housing goals that I think I, at least, and many others have in mind when we think about why a Gowanus rezoning is a good idea.
I'm so amazed and impressed to hear you say that. I never thought I'd hear a community board say that. I think you're probably right.
And have you, people say that potentially a live-work preference, a work preference could be a way out of the problem, because we have a lot of people who might be home health aides here in CV6, but not able to afford, to live here. And community boards already allow people to live and work as a basis of membership. So it shouldn't be that crazy an idea. Is that something you've considered?
Yeah, we'd certainly consider that as an option. That is a, that's an answer to a political problem, right? You could also just say there is no community preference, but if you're looking to split the difference, a live work could be a way to kind of shift things more in an equitable direction without completely tossing out the idea of a preference altogether. We had actually recommended to the city that as one of its COVID responses, that we pause on affordable housing lotteries and entirely use the existing affordable housing pipeline for essential workers. So that we made a list of things that we want the mayor to do in the last 15 months of his administration. Basement apartment regulations is one of them. And affordable housing for essential workers is another one. So that would be writ large regardless. So we would just let people live in the neighborhood of their choice. But we were clapping for 5 and 6 minutes every night in Prospect Heights where I live. And now we don't even do that, but we really never substantively did anything to help essential workers in our neighborhood continue to have affordable housing. So that's been our recommendation, is to open up all affordable housing for a period of time. Similar to after Sandy, we had a preference in the lotteries for folks who'd been displaced from Sandy. Here we have another disaster, so that's been our recommendation. But again, I think a live-work preference could be a way to kind of meet the goals of a community, to say we want this affordable housing to be for us, without violating any kind of fair housing standards.
Thank you.
Hey, Alex, I got my hand up.
Well, I'm not you can call on yourself, Mark.
Well, I believe in law and order, so I put my hand up to chat. Anyway, I have some anecdotal knowledge of the housing market in this area. And from what I've seen, it's very segmented. And if I know people are saying that there are vacancies, and a lot of them, and there are vacancies, and there are a lot of them. The problem is that trickle-down approach is not getting to affordable rents as far as I can see it. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
Well, so this is what we've been discussing a lot in Soho. And this is why we have a coalition in Soho that includes CDCs from all across the city, and not just ones that work in Lower Manhattan. So it's true that trickle down anything is not like the way you address a social justice issue. At the same time, if you had created sufficient housing supply in Soho and Lower Manhattan in the first place, people wouldn't have come looking in Williamsburg and Bushwick and Bed-Stuy. So if you had done it right 20 years ago, you could have stemmed the tide of people pushing out and out and out and creating pressures on other neighborhoods in the outer boroughs. Because there was that's half the reason why people started looking into those neighborhoods in the first place. So that's one factor where it's not, yes, if you build a $15 million penthouse, then it doesn't suddenly, the city doesn't become affordable for everybody else. But it does mean that that person doesn't say, oh, well, for 12 million, I can buy a place in Brooklyn Heights. So it does create less pressure on the housing market, regardless of where you build, where and at what income band you build. So that is the case. But certainly the affordability levels of the rezoning itself and the units that are created in the rezoning itself is going to be the most direct way to attack an affordability problem. That goes without.
Yeah, because I know at least I talk to a number of brownstone building owners and developers and all those hated people, and they have empty apartments, but they are not renting them at lower rents. They are not renting them if they can't get the rents that they want. And so that's a problem as far as I see it. And in addition to that, even if there was some mechanism to try to force them to rent it, they have strategies to avoid that. And that's why I'm so into, and have been for 20 years, into the rezoning and the Gowanus and low levels of AMI to house people in good habitable housing in our neighborhood. Anyway, thanks.
Right, and then that's one of the tactic of using a rezoning to create affordability is an additional tool other than just straight using taxpayer money for it, right? So in what we do typically is in a very low income neighborhood for these days, not even, it's still pretty expensive. It probably costs $400,000 or $500,000 a unit to create a unit, even at for a very low income band. So in a neighborhood like Gowanus, where the land values are much higher, it could cost 2 or 3 times that. So instead of providing cash to do so in a high income neighborhood, you trade zoning rights to do that. So that just creates a more efficient way to create those affordable apartments in a neighborhood where you couldn't afford to just build them with money.
I have a question, actually 2, if you don't mind. How is CHPC monitoring the next mayoral election? Because it seems like there's a few candidates there that really aren't pro-development. And it's interesting to see your chart where it has the housing stock with, with economics. As an architect, with the business side of me say, we can't have a mayor that's, not pro-development, because kind of what happened in Sunset Park, we talked about it in our office and like, that's not good. It's not smart. It has to be a smart way of developing. There's got to be a smart way of developing. I mean, we're in New York City. It's a mecca, right? You have to develop smart. And the other question of, being a resident at CV6 is, can we define affordability? Because what I can afford and what I need for my growing family is basically I'm priced out of the neighborhood. I can't live in my own neighborhood. And, I make a good living. I have a good job. I make a good living. And when we talk about affordability, it kind of just always skews towards this low AMI. And I feel like a lot of people don't talk about, the folks like myself who have a family who want to stay in Brooklyn. Have 2 kids that need a 3-bedroom, that there's none of them here, and like my other members, Mark, was saying is, you go to people that there's vacancies, we talk to people in the neighborhood, but no one's rented them. But sorry, it's like I'm going at 2 sides of my 2 sides right now. One is like the business aspect, we have to be pro-development, we have to develop, we have to figure it out because, we worked on, low income projects and, 421 projects in our office. And the other side of me, well, I'm doing that, but I can't even like figure out my own situation.
Sure.
Yeah. Fair.
So to the affordability question, affordable housing is defined kind of administratively as it is income restricted up to 165% of AMI, which these days, for a family of 3, is about $165,000-ish. Sheena, if you're still there, am I getting that right? You can put that one in the chat too. So that's the level at which, that's the outer bounds of what is considered affordable. So if I'm paying no more than 1/3 of my income towards rent and the unit is income restricted with a certain ceiling, that's the entire universe of what's considered affordable housing. So when you're negotiating on a particular project or a particular neighborhood, now the question, of course, is affordable for whom? And I think reasonable people can disagree about whether your number one goal is to provide the deepest affordability for the poorest people, or if you want to look at who's currently in the neighborhood and say, I want to keep this mix. Or we've had neighborhoods also that are very low income who have said to us, that's not what we want. We don't want to be a neighborhood of exclusively low income people. We want to push the income limits up a little bit in a way that, for example, a market rate developer may not feel comfortable doing. We think there's a market for my kid to move back to the South Bronx, for example, and say they want to come back here at 80 or 100% of AMI, but a bank doesn't think the South Bronx is ready for units at that income level. So we want to create that mix. So I think that's a totally reasonable debate to have, and neighborhoods can have that discussion separately about whether you want to only house the poorest people first, or you want to create a mix, or you want to reflect who's in the neighborhood now, or if you want to reflect the mix that you hope will be in the neighborhood in the future, right? These are all totally reasonable arguments to have. But at the end of the day, the trade-off is going to be number of units versus deeper affordability. So you can have more affordable units at higher income limits, or agree to fewer affordable housing units at deeper affordability. And that's something that CHP, we don't really put our finger on the scale of that. That's sort of something that project by project or neighborhood by neighborhood you can work out. What was the other question? Mayoral candidates. So I was there, I was at HPD from Bloomberg to the de Blasio transition through the first de Blasio term. When we were at the end of the Bloomberg administration, we all thought, when we saw that de Blasio was going to be the winner, we thought, well, surely he's going to say, I want fewer units at deeper affordability. And so we got everything ready to do fewer units at deeper affordability. I had the memo ready to go. And instead, he was asked in a debate, Mayor Bloomberg has a housing plan that's 165,000 units over 10 years. Mr. de Blasio, what's your housing plan? And what did he say? 200,000 units. Like, I think he just blurted it out. So the whole housing policy of the city of New York right now is just more than the last guy, bigger than the last guy. But that's not a housing policy. So what we're recommending to the next set of leadership, whoever that may be, is that instead of starting with a unit target, which is amazing, like I was running the HPD factory for a long time. I stand by it. I think it's an amazing management metric. Someday I'll write a Harvard Business School case study about how great this is as a management tool. Everybody knows if they're doing their job or not, but it's not a housing policy. And it doesn't tell you why you're doing it, for who you're doing it, where you're doing it. So for us, for the next mayor, we're doing this project called New Lens for New York City's housing plan. And we're writing a variety of different housing plans, each from a different perspective, so that we can kind of educate the mayoral candidates to start with their values and then back into their housing policies from there, instead of starting with a unit target and then backing into housing policies from there. So we wrote already, Sheena's on the call, she was the lead writer on this, a housing plan for an immigrant city. So what if the purpose entirely of our housing policy was to honor our past, present, and future as a city of immigrants? We're writing a feminist housing plan. We're writing a housing plan for racial equity, a housing plan for a green city, an LGBTQ housing plan. So if you take each of these different perspectives, what are the kind of housing plans that you'd come up with? So you guys did this basement apartments resolution a few months ago. And there was a pilot project in East New York to renovate 40 basement apartments. That was the first thing that got cut when COVID hit and the budget hit. And frankly, if your goal is 200,000 units, of course you cut the basements project. That's a terrible 40 individual basement homeowners that you're gonna go through the drama of DOB and BSA and all these different processes. Of course you cut that project, that's terrible. Slap a regulatory agreement on a Mitchell-Lama, fix the roof and call it a day with 1,000 units is a much better strategy. But if your goal is increase wealth for low-income homeowners of color, if your goal is help immigrant homeowners get a foothold in the housing market, then that should be the centerpiece of your housing plan. So that's why we're trying to get, and you can have different sets of values or different goals, but our strategy for the next mayor is to start with, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? What's your problem statement? Instead of starting with this metric of ever increasing unit targets, and then you kind of lose sight of why you're doing it.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's,
I know that
That's-
Joanne wanted to ask a question before we switch, I think.
yeah, I think Joanne's question was partly answered in terms of the number of units that will happen. Did you know that in terms of what will be allocated for very low income? And I think what Jessica was saying is the amount of affordable units will vary depending on which option the developers are given. So CB6 has been at least sort of pressing for the lower AMIs, and that would mean less affordable housing, less units. But that's a question that came up a lot when DCP came to us last month, and I think that's has not yet. We don't yet know how many units we're going to have because we don't know what the options are. We don't know which option has been chosen, I should say. We know what the options are. That's something, Joanne, we can talk about in the committee in terms of, putting additional pressure on which ones we want. I believe it was 1 and 3 with a very low 25% AMI in there. So.
Right. And then the other thing I would say about the kind of changes in New York's economy post-COVID and something like this, this is a plan for the next generation or longer of what the land use is going to look like along this waterfront. So I think reasonable people can disagree about if next summer New York's going to be back and this will all feel like a bad dream, or if it's going to take 5 years or 10 years for us to bounce back from this. But the questions and the rezoning and the plan for the rezoning, I think, is much, much bigger than that and takes a much longer time period. So I think if this is a short or a long blip in the rental market in New York City, I think that to me, that doesn't affect the kind of decisions that you guys should be grappling with in terms of a rezoning here.
Joanne, is that what you wanted to ask? Is that?
You know what? I might see. My concern is that I know that she spoke on the low income, but I would like to know how are they planning on helping the ones that losing their apartments, that does not have an apartment and they are in a shelter, and if you have all these vacancies in the city, you got over maybe 30,000 vacant apartments or what have you. So why aren't they trying to put the people in there that need the jobs? The ones that's working, some of them have jobs and they're living in a shelter. They need to reach out to some of these people here. You hear me? And then I'm looking at the ones that right now, whether with the COVID that's going on, like myself. Let me give you a good example. I lost my job too last month. Okay. And then I was hoping that I got it back. So I got my job back. You understand what I'm saying here? But then at the same time, people are losing their jobs too, losing their jobs. Because you got the restaurant workers, you got other people that's working too, and they're losing their job in their homes. So I'm asking, I know you study building and everything, so why can't they open their doors for people that's losing things and then welcome them in? You understand?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the kind of passion that you just described about people who are homeless in the city and our neighbors who have lost their jobs and are experiencing homelessness is not what we tend to hear when we go across the city. I think that's something we really should try to nurture as much as we can. As you can see from some of the fights in Manhattan about where the city is taking some of the vacant hotels and using those hotel rooms to help house homeless New Yorkers, those are being met with really bitter legal battles, and that's a very nice way. So I think any way that you as a community board can help nurture that empathy for homeless New Yorkers and help use this process to welcome homeless New Yorkers into your community and help support them, I think we would be wildly supportive of. And I hope that there's a lot more of you who feel that way.
Didn't HPD at one point have a whole, like actually have a policy to bring people out of shelter into the affordable units? Wasn't that a requirement at some point?
Yeah.
Is that no longer a requirement?
For most of the term sheets, I think it's a 10 or a 15%
Yeah.
requirement for term sheets, but that doesn't apply to just a solely MIH without any subsidy necessarily. But certainly, but I mean, I would be so excited to support you if that's something that Community Board 6 wanted to ask for as something in the rezoning. I mean, that's very rare and something that we need to learn. And I think if that's one of those lessons from COVID that I hope I'm not being naive that we learn, that it's not just my housing is my healthcare. It's like your housing and your healthcare is what keeps my family safe. Right? It's not just my housing and my healthcare that keeps my family safe. So for no other reason than self-interest, I think we've learned a lot about what it means to kind of stay safe as a community. So we would be, I mean, I would be so honored and touched if that's something that you guys wanted to advocate for as part of the rezoning. Thank you, Joanne, for bringing that up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation and also a lot of really great questions. I think we do have another presentation and it's 7:30. So I think, would you, is there any final question before we drop off? This one more. I mean, this is a conversation that we'll continue to have in committee as we prepare our resolutions, I'm sure, and as we move ahead into the UO process. But thank you again, and I know hopefully you'll share the your presentation with us for our records.
We're totally happy to do that. And if there's other ways that we can help support you or analysis that you all need to help make some decisions around the rezoning, that's what we're here for. So we're totally happy to help out with that. Be in touch.
Very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. You're welcome to stay on and listen to.
I'll stay on for a little while.
Mark, Mark is our chair of the Waterfront.
Yes.
Do you want to introduce DCP?
Sure, why not? We have Jonah, and we have Katie, and we have Kate, and Jonah is a Rogoff, and Katie is a Ferrara, and Kate is a Richard. And I guess who would like to kick it off for our waterfront zoning for coastal resiliency presentation?
I'll give a brief intro, and I think Jonah's going to pull up the presentation. But to say, my name is Katie Ferrara-Iannido. I know some of you, but not all of you, through a lot of work that's been put into this this project, this challenge, this important work of updating the citywide zoning that applies across our flood hazard areas, affecting the homes of 800,000 New Yorkers that are currently at risk of flooding. And what the presentation that Jonah is going to go through is detailed. It is not going to cover the full set of details that are in this lengthy proposed text, but we will share links to things like the annotated zoning text. So you can go back and look for more detail as you'd like or as needed beyond tonight. We also can continue to be available for further questions as needed. I do want to make clear that the main thing that we're asking of the community board at this time is that this text amendment was referred out to all community boards on October 19th. And the referral date of 60 days, it's out until December 28th. And that's when we're asking for you to send a recommendation, if you have one, for the City Planning Commission to consider. And I am happy to talk more about that, if needed, if we have questions on that at the end. But I think it's just helpful to keep in mind because we're going to go into some of the details here and get into some interesting questions. Just don't want to kind of lose track of where this project stands in the public review process right now. I think with that, I will pass it off to Jonah, and he's going to present for, I think, about 25 minutes. And then we'll come back for questions as you'd like. So thank you again, everybody, for participating in this.
Thanks, Katie. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
We've got it.
Great. So yeah, just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Jonah. I'm actually the planning liaison for Community District 6. I've been deeply involved with the Gowanus neighborhood plan. And also I should give a shout out to Katie, who is in the Staten Island office now, but led a lot of our resiliency and sustainability work in Gowanus until recently. So we're really excited to be here to present the zoning for coastal resiliency proposal. It's a citywide update that aims to support resilient building construction in the floodplain and enable buildings to be better prepared for major storms like Hurricane Sandy, but also for future sea level rise. We know that coastal flood issues are critical in Community District 6, particularly in Red Hook, Gowanus, and the Columbia Street waterfront. We've come out to present to the board before, as well as groups in Red Hook. So just given the familiarity and involvement that many of you have on this topic, we wanted to give a short intro, discuss the overall goals, how we got here, and then just dive into the proposal. As much as possible, we'll be focusing on the applicability within the district, and at the end, leave time for questions and discussion. So just as a quick background, while there are many sources of flooding, coastal storms present the most significant flood risk from our standpoint in terms of compromising safety and property damage. When we analyze the city's coastal risk, we focus on the area that FEMA designates as the high-risk flood zone, which has a 1% annual chance of being flooded each year. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy awakened us to a more widespread risk, which many of you know well, that went well beyond that area. Close to half of the properties that were inundated are classified as being moderate risk of flooding or having a 0.2% annual chance of flooding each year. And with climate change, the floodplain will continue to expand. By the 2050s, we project that today's moderate risk flood zone will likely be high risk for flooding, which today is home to almost 1 million New Yorkers.
Jonah, can I just stop here a second? I know we're all learning the different platforms, but in terms of filling the screen, can you just actually make your version? I know what you're looking at on your screen. Can you make your version of the PDF app actually stouter so that it will, I think, then naturally fill? You got it, exactly. Thanks. Sorry for the pause, everybody.
Oh, so sorry about that. Yes, just give me one moment.
I think that looks great. Others might speak up if there's still an issue.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
And we'll be sure to share the presentation after. Yeah, so again, this proposal builds off 2 zoning text amendments that were put in place shortly after Hurricane Sandy to aid coastal neighborhoods in their recovery and rebuilding. But those zoning rules, which were passed as temporary measures, are beginning to expire. Building on years of outreach and research, we're now proposing to make many of those temporary provisions permanent and to expand them to a wider geography. We hope that many of these provisions can help homeowners save on flood insurance costs and also help recovery efforts for future disasters, including the current COVID-19 pandemic. Based on our research and engagement, we were able to establish 4 goals that help us move from Sandy recovery to a longer-term resiliency strategy. We know that first, communities want to be able to prepare buildings for flooding, even if they're not located in what FEMA determines to be the current high-risk flood zone, especially in the areas that face moderate risk of flooding. Second, we heard people also want the option to raise their occupiable space a little higher than the current flood level that FEMA projects to better prepare for future storms and sea level rise. When people are undertaking large investments to retrofit their buildings where they live, we find that they only want to do that once. And then this leads to the third goal. When investments are made to meet resiliency standards, residents in building and business owners want more options to invest incrementally. So it's more affordable, particularly when moving mechanical equipment to a higher elevation. The fourth and last goal is, after undertaking 2 zoning updates for resiliency, we want to improve how zoning can be more nimble and efficient in responding to future disasters that would require rebuilding homes or other types of recovery. So before jumping into the proposal, I just want to take a moment to emphasize that while the focus for today is how zoning can encourage resilient building construction, we really view this as one of many strategies, or what we call a multiple lines of defense approach that seeks to work together with other public and private sector initiatives. We also want to complement local projects that we know are in various stages, such as the Red Hook interim flood protection measures, the longer term coastal resiliency project that's well underway, as well as work in tandem with the neighborhood planning work in Gowanus. So the first goal of zoning for coastal flood resiliency speaks to just where the current and proposed text would apply. So the current zoning would expand the proposed zoning would expand the applicability of the current text to a larger geography exposed to flooding of major storms. While the current text would only apply in the high risk 1% annual chance floodplain, now the moderate risk 0.2% annual chance floodplain would be allowed to use the proposed options for resilient building design. In Community District 6, this would largely cover the areas of Red Hook, Gowanus, and Columbia Street waterfront. The second goal is to support resilient building design that meets and exceeds the requirements of the Building Code's Appendix G. Starting with building envelopes, these optional rules would allow building owners to physically elevate habitable space and other building support features above expected flood elevations. Currently, zoning allows maximum height to be measured from the design flood elevation, or DFE, which we currently call the flood resistant construction elevation. However, this is only available for buildings in the 1% annual floodplain, which has a designated DFE in the building code. But to allow buildings in the 0.2% chance floodplain to take advantage of this rule, we'll be setting a standard flood elevation of 2 feet to buildings in that area. The current rules also allowed extra height in situations where buildings are located in areas with certain high flood elevations, which allows buildings to have a more functional ground floor. However, we learned over time that it also helps with long-term resiliency. Today, building heights can be bumped to 9, 10, or 12 feet, depending on the building's use and zoning district, which makes for a highly complex framework. To help address this issue, the proposal would make those height allowances more consistent by allowing building heights to be measured from a new reference plane that can be placed up to 10 feet above grade in the 1% floodplain and up to 5 feet in the 0.2% floodplain. And then just for reference, here's a map showing where the current rules apply and where we're seeking changes, which again largely affect the expanded 0.2% floodplain in Red Hook and Gowanus. So next, we'd like to update ground floor regulations to strengthen the urban design of streetscapes and conditions at the pedestrian level. The current rules allow ground floors in existing buildings that are retrofitted to be wet flood-proofed and exempted from floor area. This helps buildings become resilient while compensating the owner for the inability to use the wet flood-proofed portion of the ground floor. Our proposal would extend the exemption to both existing and new buildings, with the goal of allowing new buildings to better adapt to climate change. The current rules also include floor area exemptions for spaces that are dry flood proofed to promote active uses at the street level. There are two sets of rules. On the left, you can see a provision that applies to existing buildings, which could exempt the dry flood proofed space. But we found that they have a hard time relocating that floor area to recoup the investment of making the building watertight or dry flood proof. On the right, you can see a rule that applies to new and existing buildings, which allowed any space to be exempted from floor area if more than half of the floor is below the flood level, which we call these spaces cellars. The problem with the cellar exemption is that it resulted in many squished ground floors with low ceilings, and in some instances, even sunken ground floors below grade. Ultimately, these two exemptions ended up promoting streetscapes and ground floors that were less marketable and effective for those uses. So with that in mind, the proposal would modify these regulations to instead only allow the first 30 feet that is dry flood proofed to be exempted from floor area, provided that the space is used for non-residential use and complies with certain design standards, such as minimum transparency of windows and internal clearance. This would also help encourage active uses close to the sidewalk level to promote a safe and attractive pedestrian environment while ensuring that buildings are not out of scale. Meanwhile, when commercial ground floors are elevated higher above curb level, streetscape rules may also apply in order to mitigate the effects of blank walls. So within the district, this provision would really be focused on certain commercial corridors such as Van Brunt Street, Lorraine Street, and portions of Columbia Street. In addition, the proposal would mandate a set of streetscape requirements to improve the ground floor level design of resilient buildings. Some of you may recognize this building in Red Hook, which we often use as a poster child to demonstrate this issue. So the proposal rules aim to make existing streetscape requirements more consistent and provide more design options to ensure that resilient buildings fit within their context. The proposal would create a point system of either 1 or 3 points, depending on the elevation of the first floor above the flood elevation. For floors that are more than 5 feet above grade, points would have to be satisfied in 2 categories of mitigation. Those that improve access and then those that improve the ground floor design. And then just to illustrate how these points would be met, the proposal would provide options for different building types. The items are split into access and design categories, and they would include more options than what we currently have today, which are highlighted in orange. Further, the proposal would continue the requirement that parking on the ground floor be screened and wrapped whenever buildings meet flood-resistant construction standards. So now that we talked about, or now I should say, we'd like to talk about how existing buildings that are non-complying with zoning can be addressed, which we found to be a major barrier for completing resiliency upgrades. The 2013 flood text did not include specific provisions for lots that were really small. When designed according to resiliency standards and their underlying zoning, the homes on these lots could end up very tall and narrow with a bad internal layout, as shown on the left. And then to help address this, in 2015, we created a set of rules known as the cottage envelope that offered side and rear yard relief in exchange for a shorter height limit. The 2015 provisions were limited to only a few neighborhoods where the issue was most prevalent, but our proposal today would make the cottage envelope available across the floodplain, allowing resilient buildings to fit within their context. In addition, we're proposing more flexibility for buildings that are legally do not comply with the current bulk regulations. And the 2013 flood text already included some flexibility for the first floor above grade to be raised to the DFE and allow the home to increase non-compliances in the process of elevation. However, it did not account for living spaces below grade. So the proposal rule would allow such spaces to also be relocated above flood levels, provided certain height, lot coverage, and yard requirements are met. Another issue is many residential buildings in manufacturing districts built before 1961 do not conform to use regulations, and they can't take advantage of zoning tools to build resiliently. The 2013 flood text allowed most non-conforming 1 and 2 family homes to be reconstructed, while the 2015 recovery text allowed homes to be retrofitted, but only in certain areas. This proposal would expand the allowance across the floodplain, provided certain height and floor area parameters are met. Lastly, to account for unique situations where buildings are unable to be retrofitted as of right, we're proposing a new BSA special permit where owners can apply for relief from zoning provisions in order to meet the Appendix G standards for construction. The third goal of the proposal is to support what we call partial resiliency strategies that help building owners take incremental steps towards resiliency without requiring the building to fully comply with Appendix G. One lesson we learned was raising mechanical equipment is often the first and most cost-effective step towards resiliency. So we'd like to offer more options to place this equipment above the flood level, either on top of roofs or in a separate structure. People often opt to move this equipment from cellars to an open area of their lot because many buildings are unable to sustain the equipment's heavy load. Zoning allows some flexibility, but requires the equipment to be located close to the building wall, which we found poses a conflict with windows or access points. So as a result, the proposal would allow more flexibility to locate this equipment, provided that it's not placed too close to the rear lot line and does not exceed a certain height. For buildings with large open areas like the Red Hook houses or other NYCHA campuses, the proposal would allow mechanical equipment to be located in these open areas, but again, provided that certain bulk and streetscape rules are met. So now a big portion of the floodplain, as you know well, contains industrial and commercial businesses with buildings that can't completely elevate or dry floodproof due to the cost or just physical constraints. But many business owners want to be able to raise their equipment, their supplies, their materials to protect them from damage and loss. During our outreach, we heard that many businesses rely on below grade space for support services, especially in mixed use buildings. However, zoning prohibits most buildings from using more than the first story for non-residential use, particularly in local commercial districts. So if the building owner decides to fill in that cellar to reduce the potential for damage, many businesses are just unable to compensate for that lost cellar space. So with that in mind, the proposal would allow commercial corridors in the floodplain to use the first 2 stories for non-residential use, provided that there aren't subgrade spaces within the building. And then for existing industrial buildings that have a high lot coverage and are more constrained by floor area or putting mechanical equipment outside, we're proposing a small floor area exemption up to 500 square feet to encourage a mezzanine space that can elevate critical equipment, office space, or inventory. The proposal would also enable different types of flood protection measures to be implemented. It includes allowances for flood panels and landscape berms to be considered permitted obstructions in open areas. And then it would also allow spaces used for the storage of panels to be exempted from floor area to enable on-site storage. Lastly, when looking at our waterfront sites, zoning generally doesn't allow waterfront yards or required visual corridors to be raised to account for flood risk. Many of these sites at the water's edge are required to provide public access, meet certain design standards, but they have little flexibility to accommodate the best resiliency practices. So this proposal would offer a bit more flexibility, particularly to allow additional space for grading of the sites to help better facilitate waterfront, resiliency measures, particularly on the larger waterfront sites. The fourth and final goal we'd like to speak about is how the proposal would apply not just in the floodplain, but across the city. Hurricane Sandy really showed us that a storm's effect can go well beyond the floodplain, and in fact, have an impact on the larger energy grid. So the proposal would allow power systems, including generators, solar energy, fuel cells, batteries, to be considered permitted obstructions in open areas across the city. In addition, to ensure that all areas of the city can easily provide accessibility access, the proposal would classify both ramps and lifts as permitted obstructions in all open areas to facilitate accessible design. Another key issue is how disasters, especially those that require residents to evacuate, impact vulnerable populations. Hurricane Sandy and other storms really exposed the difficulties facing nursing homes in areas of high flood risk. Nursing homes have populations that require continual medical care, which can be particularly challenging to provide for in the event of an evacuation. Therefore, we're proposing to limit the growth of nursing homes in the 1% annual chance of floodplain and a few other high-risk areas to reduce the health consequences of evacuating residents. Lastly, Sandy showed us that a long process to update zoning rules can really slow down the response. The proposal would make certain recovery provisions available to be enabled quickly following future disasters. And some of those provisions would be implemented now to help address the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on our city. To this end, the proposal would include enabling 2 sets of rules to help support long-term recovery efforts. The first one would give property owners who hold special permits and authorizations an additional term so they can complete their original plan for construction on a slightly longer time frame. The second one would support businesses that do not conform with zoning use regulations by allowing them more than 2 years, which is the current limit of discontinuance to return to operation. So as we near the end of the presentation, I just wanted to really note that the zoning for coastal flood resiliency is designed to work in tandem with the Gowanus neighborhood plan. We feel that it complements the public realm, open space, shoreline improvements that we're considering. And in a sense of how do we address the resiliency improvements at the building scale? We'll be going more in depth when we certify Gowanus for public review, but just want to quickly highlight that examining additional grading controls and elevations for developments to meet resiliency standards, something that we're taking a close look at, and also how street ends can be built out to improve drainage and reduce flood risk. And then lastly, as Katie mentioned at the beginning, the text amendment has been referred out. We're really happy to reach this milestone. And this would start the 60-day review period. Because it's a citywide text amendment, it's not a normal ULURP process, but it's very similar. So after 60 days, we do intend this to go back to the City Planning Commission and the City Council following that. And then lastly, I just want to share a few resources. I'll be circulating this presentation after, but online we do have more information about the proposal, including an annotated zoning text, and then also a series of maps that go into the applicability across the Community District 6. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and present.
Thank you so much, Jonah, and we appreciate you coming here. A couple of things I want to say before we open it up. One is I thank you for answering the question about whether there will be more detail about the Gowanus waterfront coming up in subsequent conversation, because that was my understanding, and I don't want people to think that what is here and applies to everything is necessarily everything that's going to apply in Gowanus. The other thing I wanted to say is, as this is a zoning text amendment, I believe, I'm also the chair of the Land Use Committee. I believe there are members of the Land Use Committee who are going to want to weigh in on this, and that we may want this presentation, if not given in person by you again, at least forwarded to the Land Use Committee for their comment. I can think of a number of people who will want to comment on it, particularly since I was at some of these meetings, by the way, and many of these meetings were dominated by people from Red Hook rather than Gowanus or the rest of CB6. And there aren't that many people on this committee who are Red Hook people. And we do have some Red Hook people on the Land Use Committee who may want to specifically weigh in on this. So I just want to keep you advised of that as well. And of course, this is a zoning issue, but of course we also have interests that I assume DCP is going to come back and discuss with us with regard to how you're coordinating with the EPA and the rest of the federal government, the Army Corps, all those aspects that may have to do with how we protect ourselves from flooding in the future in the face of surges and climate change and sea level rise. So with that, I will open it up to everybody else to give their questions and comments. Thank you very much again to all of you.
I have a question, but also a statement first. First, I want to say I think it's great that you're allowing ramps and stuff to be permitted obstructions. I know that's something our office deals with a lot, especially, we're doing our project now in Red Hook, and we're dealing with that a lot, especially the floodplain. The one thing I wanted to go back on, I had a question on is like, I think it was page 31 or 32, which allows for, I believe, storage to be on the second level or mezzanine level. Not so much the mezzanine, but I think it was the second floor. But I think there was a note, right? Yeah, this one. Actually, go back one. Sorry, 30 maybe. Yeah, so this one. So space is still counted towards floor area and is included in parking calculations. How's that going to work? Because I mean, in my opinion, if we're designing a building that's going to be a tenant building, right? So there's going to be retail, and then the seller's not counted as floor area. So they're basically they have to do foundations anyway. So they're going to basically excavate, do a cellar, and all that's going to be storage space. It's going to be rentable for, say, the retail, the ground floor. Now, if the owner says, okay, I'm going to put it on the second floor, but he's going to count it as FAR, it's a tougher sell. But because if the owner has a building and he rents it to, say, a tenant, and it gets flooded, it's hard for the landlord to say like, okay, well, tenant, you got flooded, then go to your business insurance to get recouped on your merchandise and on your cellar. Whereas if you put on the second floor, if there's a certain amount of verbiage in the text, in the zoning text, which allows a certain percentage of that floor to not be counted as FAR if it's designated as storage space. And, as I'm saying this, I'm trying to think of all the developers that are going to use this against us. If you don't use it as, if you say, okay, this is storage space for retail, it's tied into the retail, it can only be tied to the retail. Is there a certain allowance for allowing some FAR to be built up there and not count towards floor area? I think it's more incentive for them to put it up there. I'm just curious to see if there's any thought process of how, if you guys thought about that, or how's that really going to work? Because it seems like if you're counting storage space as any FAR and it's for parking calcs, especially in Red Hook, it's a tougher sell. I'm just kind of spitting it out as it comes to my head. Just has any thought been put into that? And is the reason why it's included in parking calculations?
It's a good question. I'm going to try to give an answer, but I'd like to defer to Katie a little. My understanding is this is meant to be kind of work in tandem with the dry flood proofing effort, to where you're exempting the floor area 30 feet from the street. So our goal is to really encourage the dry flood proofing, but also compensate for that by allowing the second floor to be used for commercial, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I would just add the context that this second floor allowance for using that commercial space where it wasn't before is only opened up in the case that the building has is built with or has its basement actually filled in, because the building has become Appendix G compliant, which means they're likely unlocking. The kind of test cases that we did in this, indicated that they were likely unlocking part, if not the entire ground floor as exempted floor area, which obviously provides more flexibility. But yeah, it's a helpful note about kind of, considering the effects of that space counting towards parking. That's something that we can take back and would be a helpful comment.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I think it gives us more flexibility to kind of sell to the owner or to the developer. But they love that. They love the sellers because it doesn't count as floor area, and it's just getting stuff out of the cellar is going to be tough. But we're looking at a project now. We're actually looking to do wet flood proofing parking below grade because they can get more. And Red Hook has a lot of contaminated soil, so they're taking away 10 feet of soil. They're excavating anyway, so like, why not use it? Why not? Why would we put back more soil? It's economics too, right? Why put back new soil if I'm taking it out? Let's flood it. So it's kind of something I'm dealing with now. But thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask? Maybe this is a basic question, but I assume that the 1% floodplain and the 0.2% floodplain catchment area or coverage area is dynamic, so that it's going to take account of how that changes over the next 30 and 50 and 100 years. And if it is dynamic, how often is it updated, and what assumptions are being built into that? Is that something that is under the city's control. I imagine there's a lot of disagreement and different kind of estimate about how much temperature rise we should expect to see over the next century, and I'm sure that would influence some of these calculations. So that's my question.
Jonah, could you go back actually to the slide that I think some people may have missed because it was still when the screen was small? I think it's the second slide, the 3 different maps.
Yep.
That's a great question. That was Alec, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. The proposal is to tie the applicability of this zoning to the federal flood insurance rate maps put out by FEMA, which is, that is the agency that controls where we understand the 1% and the 0.02% chance area to be. It is not updated terribly frequently. In fact, we are operating right now off of preliminary maps that are dated 2015. They were actually conducted in 2013. And before that, the last time that those maps have been updated was actually 1983. They were digitized in 2007, but they were not updated since where the line actually landed since 1983. And right now, as many may be aware, the city appealed the 2015 maps, and so they are being refined, and we are expecting them in the next to be finalized, and that line, that 1% chance flood line and 0.2% chance flood line, refined and specified by FEMA in the next few years. I think I've heard 2024. There's been a bit of a delay, in particular this year, as you might expect. But basically, we do understand that over time, that line will change. And in some cases, it will change by reducing potentially the amount of area covered by the floodplain. In some cases where they're planning for larger infrastructure, for example, offshore infrastructure can affect that line, and there will be mapping efforts, I think, after that. But the intent here, the reason I had Jonah bring up this map was really that kind of with that, I guess, constraint that we have of being tied to existing maps, in this case, the FEMA flood maps, we're attempting to make the applicability as expansive as possible and as reasonable, and have found that by using the 0.2%, by expanding applicability of most of these provisions to the 0.2% chance flood area, we're actually covering a lot of the Sandy storm surge area, and perhaps more importantly, essentially covering the area that we understand to be where the 1% chance floodplain, so 100-year storm or 1% chance of floodwaters reaching there in an annual storm, where that's gonna lie in the 2050s when we consider climate change and the New York City panel on climate change's projections in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, there's 2 questions in the chat on the related to the uses in the ground floors there. One is related to any opportunities in terms of developing this specifically to MWBE businesses, which is a big effort I know in part of the city and the state. And then also about any studies, positive or negative, that these updated plans will have on property values or property insurance costs. And I think, and then David's follow-up question, I think, is about hidden parking at the ground level, and could there be more cost-effective and efficient uses and other options? So has there been any studies around that or a development chart about what would go in those spaces?
I think those are great questions. I would go back to kind of our focus is on how buildings can be more resilient. And I think those are really good points that we can take back. And it's really an collaboration with other agencies as well. On the question about are there studies for property values, I would kind of turn to Katie, but I think what we're trying to do is really assist property owners and buildings be better able to make these repairs and kind of let have zoning be less of a barrier, and create kind of like targeted incentives for resiliency upgrades.
I can add to that we did study throughout and use resources to the extent they kind of grew over the last 7-8 years as the department was working on this, particularly on the trajectory of flood insurance costs and what changes how certain changes a property owner can make to their property actually affect the cost of their flood insurance. And the spirit of all of these kind of additional flexibilities that are being proposed are in order to help, with the understanding that many of these are a huge investment, they're also almost all linked to the potential to reduce a homeowner's or property owner's flood insurance cost. So elevating above the design flood elevation, if you want to take advantage of that kind of height bump that's allowed, or height measurement bump that's proposed, that can be a huge relief to, by orders of magnitude to the cost of an annual flood insurance. Of course, that's probably among the most expensive efforts that a current homeowner could make, elevating their entire property, which is why there was also great attention paid to how we could increase the opportunities for incremental changes. So if all you can do is afford to get your mechanical equipment out of your basement and onto an upper level or onto an elevated platform in the yard, that can also provide humongous financial relief in terms of recovery after a storm, for example. So the proposal here is to allow that kind of work without then necessarily triggering the requirement to update the entire home or property to meet Appendix G requirements, which may not be possible in one go.
You have another question, Alec. You've had these interim zoning regulations for quite some time, and you talked about just now about how you want to make them somewhat more flexible in certain ways. How effective have the interim zoning regulations been in upgrading properties, particularly properties in our community district, but also throughout the city, in terms of moving this resiliency forward?
That's a great question. I mean, I know when I go through Red Hook, you can kind of point out buildings that have bumped up or would have otherwise had row homes, for example, would have otherwise had occupiable space in the basement that have been reconstructed for one reason or another over the recent years since this has been applicable. And if you look closely, you might see a recessed upper floor instead of a basement unit, for example. I'm sure we do have numbers on that. I haven't looked at them recently. I know our Waterfront division was tracking building permits to take a look at taking advantage of these things. I can get back to you on that. There are a lot of, there's a lot of, I think it's easier to track buildings that take advantage of or that make use of or are required to make use of Appendix G, so the requirements that are kind of the baseline for a new building. It might take a little bit more to parse out who's taking advantage of zoning relief. But that is a great question. Thank you.
It's a big issue in Red Hook. All of that is a huge issue in Red Hook, somewhat of an issue in Gowanus. And so if you can get us that information and updated, it would be terrific, because I want this to be successful. And if you create rules that people don't follow, it doesn't help us with resiliency.
We're happy to look into that more.
Thanks.
Since now that I understand that I understood that this was really about how to build. You didn't mention much about the materials. I'm just wondering, did you look into types of, I'm sure you looked far and wide because there are whole, different cultures that live in water, areas. But it looked to me like it was poured concrete and sort of standard building materials from New York City. And I'm just wondering, did you look at other types and ways to build?
I'm not sure I can answer that just now in terms of what the what the full scope of things that were explored were. I mean, the intent of these provisions is kind of not necessarily to limit the the range of materials or kind of the flexibility people have now of how to construct their home. It's more to add flexibility. So I can't think of a provision that's proposed with kind of a limited set of materiality at this point, but maybe something that we can get back to you on.
Yeah, I know that a question, it often comes up when you're doing dry flood proofing versus wet flood proofing. So there, in those cases, the types of material you use is really important. And I also just want to recognize Victor's comment in the chat where building code kicks in. That was something I was just going to mention too, that often building code plays a key role in the types of material, whether it's in the floodplain or not. And there's kind of different rules related to if it's a new building versus an enlargement. So I think it's a great question, but it really depends on each case. And
How are we doing, Alec?
I don't see any additional questions in the chat that haven't been answered yet.
Well, then in that case, I want to thank all our guests for giving us this information, the presentation. And please do get back with us with the follow-ups. And I think we'll get back to you with regard to how we're going to deal with a resolution concerning the text amendment as we loop in our land use committee. So thank you once again, all of you. And if anybody else has anything to say, I'm going to say good night and I'm going to go have my dinner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.
Night.